prepared papers in an urgent application. Overnight, woke up an interim order to seal the files pending a ruling on the merits of the privilege which Mr. Bohoshi claimed. We argued the matter up to the highest court, having obtained the interim interdict. The SCA and that SCA we lost. And here's a punchline, and the important thing which will resonate later today. The court properly held that privilege is given to and is for the benefit of the client. And it's not there to shield the criminal conduct on the part of the legal profession. So when lawyers scream privilege, we as judges are duty-bound to examine it quite carefully to see whether it is a ruse to shield the otherwise unethical and or improper conduct of attorneys. I'm done with that. Our friend died not so long ago, and most of the riches had disappeared once the third-party practice had also disappeared. And may he rest in peace, because he always briefed me. I was his prime. I've chosen to reflect on the connection between the rule of law, democratic accountability, and social justice within an African context. Given limited time I have here today, and to ponder more deeply over these concepts within the realm of public law, I will nonetheless want to talk this evening to you all about the use and deployment of public power in our respective countries in this continent. First, let's talk a little about what the rule of law is. It is Hobbes, the English thinker, who made the tried but observation that without a social contract, life would be short, nasty, and brutish. This sounded brilliant initially, but in fact, it was not exactly so. Most indigenous communities around the world and in our continent knew this. They lived in organized communal societies under the sway of folklore and binding customary indigenous law. This thus makes a surprising point that society submit to the rule of law to achieve common and legitimate public purpose. People don't just live in an open-ended way. They quickly organize themselves and assume rules that would govern the way they behave towards each other and how public power is deployed in society. Of course, in the course of history, people first submitted to the rule by men and women. For instance, kingship, the feudal system, traditional leadership. Then often might was right. The strongest often was the one who gained the entitlement to rule. But importantly, that was usually without accountability to the ruled subjects and without recourse in favor of the ruled subject. Now most countries in the world, and indeed in Africa, have conferred the power to make laws and to govern on elected representatives of the people. Think of the impressive AU protocol on representative democracy and on human and people's rights. This means that our people on the continent have made an election to submit to the rule of law, which is to be distinguished from the rule by law, which is applied in a free and non-democratic setting. So simply, we don't need a very brilliant treatise by Dicey on the rule of law to embrace it and to understand its obvious usefulness. We have committed to elect some amongst us to uphold the supreme law, to make laws, to govern, to apportion public resources, to use them in favor of society. And so to speak, we have granted some amongst us the authority to exercise public power. But we like to put it in simple terms, the authority to rule us. This is electoral hygiene. The power flows from elections, and therefore you need optimal hygiene. We must hold regular and free and fair elections at local and national spheres. The source, legitimacy, and usefulness of public power derives from valid electoral processes. Sadly, and indeed often, in our continent, we have not always, in our behavior, accorded with this primal source of public power the reverence and efficiency it warrants. Many a civil war on the continent is sparked by electoral fraud or failure to abide by electoral outcomes. In other words, the will of the people, and therefore the source of accountability, is thwarted right at the fountain, at its base, at the point of elections. For now, enough said about electoral culture and hygiene. Once elected, public representatives owe accountability to those they represent. They are our agents. We have voted them into power. While some constitutions on the continent impose this requirement, it being accountability, will still arise from the democratic ethos. The mere induction of a democracy implies that there will be a level of accountability. Those who hold public power vis-a-vis those who don't hold public power. So ordinarily, public power must be exercised, not only transparently or openly, for a simpler word, but for the benefit of the public at large. This is so because public power is conferred by law and electoral processes only for one reason, only for one purpose. That is to advance the public good. Our representative government must use its wherewithal to create and maintain good governance. It must protect us. It must advance our rights and entitlements as inhabitants and citizens. A good government must ward off harm. It must take all means to foster economic activity that accrues the benefit of all. It must create inclusive growth and well-being. Just as important is that all public power must be derived from and exerted in accordance with the law. You don't wake up one morning and decide that this is the power I have. It must be preset, pre-written, and known to all before it is actually exercised. In other words, where the law does not grant a power expressly or implicitly, that power does not exist and may not be exercised. And we know when on a continent, the opposite happens very often. Now, all of what I've said is trite. There's nothing new. There's nothing very clever. But it's something that ought to be said. And it's very important as I move on, you will follow this. It is self-evident that countries that observe the core tenets of democratic practice and remain by and large accountable to its electorates and inhabitants tend to have continuous and inclusive development and growth. This observation is also true when democratic practice hobbles or is severely undermined, and accountability to the people is non-existent or low, when misgovernance is tolerated and allowed to continue, where socio-economic development, I'm afraid, also stumbles, and I'm afraid poverty also abounds. When elected governments fail to observe high standards of revenue collection, revenue protection, and appropriation when public resources are misused, are diverted. Citizens and inhabitants are not beneficiaries of the lawful use of public resources. Poverty and underdevelopment must ensue. Look at our continent. Look how poor the people of Africa are and have become and are becoming. Look at the low levels of social and economic development from jurisdiction to jurisdiction on our continent. Look at the perennial threats of food security and famine. Think about it. Ukrainians are 5 million, and they're producing grain for most of us, including the African continent. How does this happen? Look at how the extraction economy of most African states has not benefited the grassroots inhabitants. There's oil there, there's magnesium there, there is this there, there's gold there, there's diamond there, there's phosphate there, there is everything here and there in different countries of the African continent. But grassroots inhabitants have not benefited from that. They remain dismally poor. If anything, people of many African countries have fallen victim of internecine wars over the control of our vast minerals and gas deposits. Warlords and purveyors of raw material unleash war on their own people, or competing gang lords to the detriment of the socio-economic justice which ordinary Africans are entitled to. I must stop somewhere. I'm getting more and more emotional and angrier. But I sought to make the proposition that there is an inextricable link between the rule of law, democratic accountability, and social justice. These requirements are not fancy jurisprudential concepts, but genuine and indispensable requirements for a progressive, inclusive social system that is caring and responsive. It is worth remembering that in between elections, many jurisdictions on our continent seek to make provision for participatory democracy. In other words, you don't wait for 5 years for elections to come. These are multiple measures by members of the public to persuade their government to act within the law, or reasonable, or in favor of public good, or in favor of social justice. Some citizens take to the streets in protest marches. Lately, we have all observed street protests, or even uprisings in countries around the world. Think about the inhabitants and ordinary citizens of Sri Lanka, of Indonesia, of Bangladesh, of Mexico, of Malaysia, of the United States of America. They were all in the streets one day, of Tunisia, of India, of Libya, to mention just a few, where people take to the streets to talk to their rulers. And we've observed leaders recalled through public demand in between elections. Johnson of the UK comes to mind, or the president of Sri Lanka. Where I come from, the Republic of South Africa, street protests are frequent and ever increasing. There was one today. When there is a denigration of the rule of law, of governance, dishonoring legitimate use of public funds and resources, when there is no accountability and citizens can't hold the feet of the rulers to the fire, poverty and want but also includes. And that hurts the poor even more. And that ordinarily is undesirable. And therefore, a judicial system is a vital component of democratic accountability. Judges play a vital role in a society if left alone to do their work without fear or favor. Judges, in most societies, so the Constitution says at least, bear the obligation to police compliance with the law, to stop all the things that are horrible that I've just talked about. Judges must bother about the impact of the law and whether it produces justice and not merely formulaic rules of law within a particular judicial system. Of course, the highest form of accountability. Besides the people, besides the courts. Besides NGOs. And other progressive formations within society is electoral accountability. That's the ultimate form of accountability. The people must have the space to change their representatives. This is fair when the representatives don't do what they have to do. Because the genuine underpinning of democratic practice under the rule of law is insecurity of tenure. That bears repetition. The underpinning of the democratic practice is insecurity of tenure. Public office is always premised on the notion that the term will end or might end electorally. And that threat to fulfill public office is an ultimate accountability which rests and sits in the hands of the people. And that much people in a developed democracy, or developing democracy know. They, remember when I started with this lecture, employ those who wield public power. And they can remove those who wield public power if they are not good representatives who do not advance public good. As I conclude, I must make the point that I make in many places. Recap. I've talked about the rule of law, about accountability, and about social justice. I've drawn your attention to the connection between those three. We don't have law just because we have law. Its real purpose ultimately is to produce a just society, a socially just society. In other words, ultimate purpose would be to help eradicate poverty and misery and oppression of those who are least empowered in society. I trust and believe, Mr. Namache, that Africa must rise, and Africa will rise. Vernon is quite right. For you young people, Africa has to rise in your lifetime. And it's only when we repeat these vital features of a just society, even as lawyers, it becomes something that will ultimately accrue to a society where law reigns, where democratic practice is observed and reigns, and where our people will escape all of this poverty that surrounds them. Thank you for listening. If you've forgotten everything else, you'll do well to remember Africa must rise in our lifetime. I thank you. Good night.